The allure of exploration has always fascinated humankind. For centuries, explorers have ventured into the unknown, charting uninhabited territories, scaling mountains and crossing vast oceans. But beyond the physical challenges these explorers face, there lies a psychological trial, one that often goes unnoticed in the excitement of discovery. In many cases, explorers venture into isolation so extreme that it affects their mental health, leading them to confront not just the harsh elements of nature, but the terrifying landscape of their own minds. The question is, why do explorers lose their minds in isolation? At the heart of this phenomenon is the concept of prolonged isolation. While isolation itself is often used as a punishment in jails or a necessary condition for scientific research, it's also one of the most intense forms of psychological stress. Humans are social creatures, and our brains are wired to interact with others. When these interactions are removed, especially for extended periods, it starts to take a toll on our minds. For explorers, the isolation can come in many forms. Navigating through desolate, uninhabited regions, spending months in a remote base, or being alone in the wild with no contact with civilization. The lack of social interaction, coupled with the overwhelming silence of the environment, can lead to psychological distress that manifests in troubling ways. When explorers are alone, their sense of self begins to shift. They are no longer surrounded by others who provide feedback or affirm their sense of reality. In social settings, the mind is constantly reassured by others' reactions, behaviors, and comments. There is a constant feedback loop that allows us to gauge where we stand in the world. But in isolation, that loop is broken. The absence of social feedback can create a sense of disconnection from the self. Over time, this can lead to what is known as identity dissolution, a psychological state in which the individual loses touch with their sense of self and begins to feel as if they no longer exist as a distinct individual. For explorers, this loss of self can be particularly dangerous, as they rely on their sense of identity to stay focused on their mission. Isolation also presents significant physical challenges that indirectly affect the mind. When explorers are removed from the familiar comforts of daily life, sleeping in a comfortable bed, having regular meals, or simply engaging in casual conversation, their body begins to suffer. Lack of sleep is one of the most dangerous effects of isolation. Without a consistent sleep schedule, the body's natural rhythms begin to unravel, leading to increased fatigue, irritability, and a breakdown in cognitive function. The sleep deprivation caused by isolation has been shown to impair decision-making, problem-solving, and emotional regulation, creating a perfect storm for psychological distress. When explorers are sleep-deprived and exhausted, their ability to reason and cope with stress diminishes, leaving them vulnerable to anxiety, depression, and paranoia. The fear of the unknown also plays a significant role in the psychological toll of isolation. Explorers often face environments that are so alien and inhospitable that they push the limits of human endurance. This fear can be paralyzing, especially when an explorer is alone and isolated in a dangerous terrain. The fear of survival, of facing natural threats like wild animals, extreme weather conditions, or the sheer unknown aspects of an uncharted region, can lead to a hypervigilant state. This constant fear, combined with the lack of social reassurance, forces the mind into overdrive. It is often in these moments that the psychological walls begin to crack, and irrational thoughts start to invade. Psychological research has shown that humans have a biological need for connection. Our mental health thrives when we are surrounded by others, when we have people to talk to share experiences with, and to validate our perceptions. When that need for social interaction is taken away, we begin to lose our grip on reality. In the case of explorers, they are forced to confront this fundamental psychological need in the most extreme way possible. This is where the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance comes into play. The brain, in an attempt to reconcile the isolation, begins to distort reality. In some cases, explorers report hallucinations, hearing voices or seeing things that aren't there. The mind, deprived of human interaction and overstimulated by fear, creates false narratives to cope with the isolation. These distortions can be terrifying, leading to intense feelings of paranoia and delusion. Moreover, the mental health consequences of isolation are not just short-term. Over weeks, months, and even years, the psychological effects of being cut off from the world can compound and become more severe. Depression is one of the most common mental health disorders faced by explorers in isolation. The constant stress of living in harsh environments, coupled with the inability to connect with others, can cause feelings of hopelessness and despair. The explorer may begin to feel that their efforts are futile, that there is no point to their mission, and that they will never return home. This sense of meaninglessness can become all-consuming, leading to a psychological breakdown. The isolation, instead of offering clarity and focus, becomes a form of psychological entrapment. In addition to depression, anxiety is another common consequence of isolation. The longer the isolation continues, the more anxious the explorer becomes about returning to society. The thought of re-entering a world that feels foreign after months of solitude can be overwhelming. In some extreme cases, explorers may develop social anxiety or agoraphobia, the fear of being in crowded or social situations. The isolation they experience in the wild becomes a safe haven, and the idea of re-engaging with society creates a sense of dread and psychological unease. Finally, one of the most insidious effects of isolation is the psychological breakdown that occurs when the individual no longer has the mental tools to cope with the overwhelming stress. As explorers become more isolated, their ability to process emotions, handle stress, and make rational decisions deteriorates. The mind begins to fragment as the individual struggles to maintain a sense of normalcy in an environment that is anything but normal. They may experience mood swings, irrational thoughts, and a complete loss of emotional regulation. In some cases, they may even experience full-blown psychosis, a condition where the mind loses touch with reality altogether. Isolation in many ways becomes a psychological incubator, a place where the mind is pushed to its limits. It reveals the fragile nature of human psychology when faced with extended periods of solitude and danger. The individual, once strong and capable, becomes an entity consumed by fear, anxiety, and emotional instability. As we continue to explore the psychological effects of isolation on explorers, it's important to dive deeper into the neuroscientific and biological factors that make prolonged solitude so taxing on the mind. The human brain is not wired to withstand extended isolation. For the most part, we are social animals. Our brains thrive on social interaction, and when deprived of it, our bodies and minds start to react in profoundly negative ways. The more we understand how the brain responds to isolation, the clearer it becomes that the psychological breakdown faced by explorers is not just a psychological issue, but a biological one. One of the most significant ways that isolation affects the brain is through the disruption of dopamine levels. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter involved in feelings of pleasure and reward. It plays a crucial role in motivation, learning, and emotional regulation. In normal, everyday life, we experience dopamine surges when we engage in activities that bring us pleasure or satisfaction. Whether it's eating, socializing, or accomplishing a task. These small rewards help regulate our emotional states and keep us motivated to continue our efforts. However, in isolation, these sources of dopamine are limited or non-existent. Explorers, cut off from social interactions, rewards, or stimuli that would normally trigger dopamine release, begin to experience dopamine depletion. Dopamine depletion leads to feelings of anhedonia, a psychological condition where a person is unable to feel pleasure or satisfaction. When the brain is deprived of the usual sources of stimulation, it begins to feel a sense of emotional numbness. This loss of pleasure and motivation can be particularly dangerous for explorers, who rely on their mental drive to keep them focused on their goals. As their brain's reward system malfunctions, they may begin to feel a lack of purpose, further increasing their desire to escape or retreat from their current reality. The physical toll of isolation doesn't stop with dopamine depletion. The lack of external stimuli and the overwhelming boredom that accompanies prolonged solitude can have devastating effects on the brain's ability to function. When an explorer is cut off from other human beings and experiences a scarcity of novel experiences, the brain starts to slow down. Research has shown that neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to adapt and form new connections, is significantly impaired when there is little to stimulate the brain. Without new challenges or engaging stimuli, the brain starts to fall into a state of cognitive inertia. In simple terms, the brain becomes sluggish and less able to process information or make decisions effectively. This mental decline is compounded by the lack of structure in the isolated environment. In normal life, we have schedules, routines, and external expectations that provide a framework for our daily activities. We go to work, school, or engage in social activities, and these tasks give our lives structure and purpose. However, explorers in isolation often find themselves with nothing to do but wait. The absence of structure leads to a loss of time perception, a phenomenon in which individuals lose track of the passage of time. Days blend into each other, and without external cues, the sense of time distortion becomes a psychological burden. This disorientation makes it increasingly difficult to maintain a healthy mental state. The absence of meaningful tasks and the continuous loop of nothingness can leave the individual feeling as though they are trapped in an emotional vacuum. This state of existential despair is not just a result of the external environment, but also of the mental state induced by isolation. Without the usual distractions or connections, the individual becomes left to their own thoughts. Often thoughts that can turn inward and become more negative and self-destructive. The isolation becomes an amplifier for negative thinking patterns such as rumination, where the mind becomes fixated on past mistakes, failures, or fears. This constant cycle of negative thoughts can spiral into depression, causing the explorer to feel that there is no escape from the mental cage they have locked themselves into. Another key factor contributing to the psychological breakdown in isolation is sleep deprivation. The sleep cycle plays a crucial role in maintaining mental health, and without a proper sleep schedule, the brain begins to experience significant difficulties. Chronic sleep deprivation, which is common in extreme isolation, affects the brain's ability to regulate mood, memory, and decision-making. Sleep is essential for consolidating memories, processing emotions, and restoring mental and emotional balance. When explorers are cut off from normal sleep patterns, whether due to the harsh conditions of the environment or psychological stress, cognitive impairments start to emerge. They may find it difficult to concentrate, remember important details, or make rational decisions. As the individual becomes more sleep-deprived, the chances of experiencing hallucinations and paranoia increase. The mind, already under strain from isolation, begins to distort reality, creating an even more terrifying and disorienting experience. The brain is designed to function optimally when it is exposed to a balanced mix of physical, emotional, and social stimuli. In isolation, the individual is deprived of this balance, which causes the brain to fall into a state of cognitive and emotional chaos. The longer the period of isolation, the more pronounced these effects become. But it's not just the lack of stimuli that harms the brain. Overexposure to environmental stressors such as extreme cold, heat, or lack of food can also have a direct effect on mental health. When an explorer is placed in an environment that causes constant physical stress, it triggers a fight-or-flight response that floods the body with stress hormones, like cortisol and adrenaline. While these hormones are useful for short bursts of action, prolonged exposure to them causes mental fatigue, anxiety, and a heightened state of fear. Another interesting phenomenon that arises in extreme isolation is the development of delusions and hallucinations. Human brains are wired to be social and interactive. When deprived of contact with others, the brain begins to create imaginary companions or experiences. Explorers often report hearing voices or seeing figures in the distance, even when no one is around. This is the mind's way of coping with the overwhelming absence of social stimulation. It's important to note that these delusions are not a sign of mental weakness, but a natural response to the extreme conditions of isolation. The mind, in an attempt to compensate for the lack of connection, begins to create alternate realities. These hallucinations can be terrifying, as the individual begins to lose their sense of what is real and what is imagined. This psychological break from reality is one of the key markers of psychosis, and for explorers, it can be the beginning of a complete mental collapse. What is clear from these psychological effects is that isolation takes an enormous toll on the mind. It pushes the boundaries of human endurance, forcing the brain to adapt to conditions it was not designed to withstand. The physical isolation that explorers endure is a reflection of a much deeper, more complex psychological journey. For those who endure extreme isolation, the consequences are profound and irreversible, leaving them mentally scarred long after they return from their solitary experiences. As we continue to explore the psychological consequences of isolation, we delve deeper into how the neuroscientific and emotional impacts continue to manifest in explorers long after they return to civilization. The initial stages of isolation bring immediate cognitive and emotional difficulties, but it is in the long-term aftermath of isolation that the most profound changes take place. Prolonged exposure to solitude can leave lasting scars on the brain, affecting not just how explorers function in their day-to-day lives, but also how they perceive the world around them. Post-isolation stress and re-entry trauma are often overlooked, but they are as real and devastating as any physical injury. One of the most troubling effects of extreme isolation is the psychological rewiring of the brain's emotional and cognitive systems. The isolation process creates significant disruptions in the way emotions are processed, leading to heightened emotional sensitivity or, conversely, emotional numbness. These emotional imbalances are a direct consequence of the brain's adaptation to solitude. In an isolated environment, the brain has to cope with the absence of social feedback, which over time results in an imbalance of emotional regulation. The absence of social stimuli means the brain is deprived of the emotional resonance that comes from human interaction. This emotional numbing occurs as the brain's natural coping mechanisms take over. The individual may become emotionally detached, not just from their surroundings but from themselves. This dissociation from one's emotions is a defense mechanism. The brain tries to suppress overwhelming feelings of fear, anxiety, and sadness in order to maintain mental stability. While this numbing effect may serve as a short-term coping strategy, over time it can result in a disconnect from reality. For explorers, this disconnection can manifest as an inability to form meaningful emotional connections, even once they return to civilization. They may find it difficult to reintegrate into relationships with loved ones or colleagues, as they have grown so accustomed to managing emotions in isolation. This emotional disconnect makes the individual feel like an outsider, even in their own life. This emotional numbness is often compounded by the fear of vulnerability. In isolation, the explorer has had to rely solely on themselves for emotional survival. The ability to lean on others or seek emotional support has been stripped away, leaving them to build emotional fortitude on their own. This results in a fear of weakness, the fear that dependence on others may lead to feelings of being overwhelmed. As a result, explorers often struggle to ask for help or lean on others for support after they've returned from their isolated experiences. This psychological isolation, coupled with the inability to engage in vulnerability, can lead to a profound feeling of loneliness, even when surrounded by people who care. Another deeply psychological issue that arises from isolation is the loss of time perception. When living in extreme isolation, especially in environments with little to no sensory input, the brain begins to distort time. Days blend into nights, and the traditional markers of time, meals, social interactions, work, are no longer present. This distortion of time perception has been shown to have a direct impact on the mental health of explorers. They begin to lose track of how much time has passed, often feeling like weeks stretch into months and months into years. This creates a distortion of reality, where the individual begins to feel unmoored from the structure of everyday life. It is as though they are stuck in a timeless void, unable to orient themselves in the world around them. For some, the loss of time perception becomes so profound that they experience a complete collapse of memory. The human brain is designed to remember events in a structured manner, using time and context to organize and make sense of experiences. In the absence of regular time markers such as dates, events, and interactions, the individual begins to lose their ability to form coherent memories. They may struggle to recall the sequence of events or experiences they had before isolation. This memory fragmentation not only impacts their personal recollections but also affects their ability to plan for the future. With a fractured memory and a distorted perception of time, the explorer struggles to move forward in life, caught in a psychological state of stasis. This sense of being stuck in the past, unable to form a clear vision of the future, is one of the most debilitating psychological consequences of prolonged isolation. The loss of time perception and memory fragmentation is intricately connected to another significant effect of isolation: the psychological breakdown of the self. The process of self-perception is deeply intertwined with our ability to see ourselves in relation to others. In isolation, where there is no mirror, either physical or social, there is no way to gauge how we are perceived by the world. This lack of reflection creates an emotional and cognitive disorientation. The individual may begin to question their own existence, their purpose, and their identity. Without the usual external feedback from the world, the explorer can no longer be sure of who they are. This leads to a crisis of identity that can be psychologically devastating. Many explorers who return from extreme isolation struggle with their sense of self, as they can no longer reconcile the person they were before the isolation with the person they've become during their time alone. This internal psychological war leaves the individual in a constant state of confusion, unable to move forward. In extreme cases, this identity crisis can lead to a psychological condition known as existential depression. Existential depression is characterized by a profound sense of meaninglessness and disconnection. The individual feels as though life lacks purpose, and that the effort to continue is pointless. For explorers who have spent long periods of time in isolation, the profound disconnection from themselves and the world can lead to a complete collapse of meaning. The activities they once engaged in with passion, exploring, discovering, and achieving, can no longer provide them with the same sense of fulfillment. They may feel that the external world no longer offers the meaning or satisfaction they once sought. This existential crisis forces the individual to confront the ultimate question of life: what is the point of it all? This existential vacuum also manifests in feelings of depersonalization, where the individual begins to feel as though they are observing their own life from the outside, as if they are a mere spectator of their existence rather than an active participant. Depersonalization can create a sense of disembodiment, where the explorer feels like they are no longer fully connected to their own physical body or mind. This psychological detachment further deepens the sense of loneliness and alienation, as the individual struggles to find any true connection to the world around them. They may even experience moments of derealization, where the world itself seems strange, foreign, and disconnected from their own lived reality. Ultimately, the psychological effects of extreme isolation lead to a deeper understanding of the fragility of the human mind. The mind, much like the body, has its limits. While the human spirit is often celebrated for its resilience and strength, the mind is equally vulnerable to the forces of stress, loneliness, and sensory deprivation. For explorers, the challenge of surviving isolation is not just physical, it is psychological. And it is often the psychological aftermath of isolation that leaves the deepest scars. It is a reminder that, as humans, we are not meant to live in solitude. We are not meant to face the vast unknown alone. Our psychological survival depends on connection, and when that connection is severed, the mind begins to unravel. As we delve deeper into the psychological effects of isolation, it's clear that one of the most intense and devastating consequences for explorers is the gradual erosion of mental stability. The effects of prolonged isolation don't just affect emotions or identity, they reach into the very core of our cognitive functioning. The human brain, designed to interact with the world and others, begins to deteriorate under extreme loneliness, and in the case of explorers, this deterioration can lead to psychotic breaks, hallucinations, and a complete breakdown of rational thinking. The concept of psychological breakdown is essential in understanding how isolation changes an individual's perception of reality, and why explorers are particularly vulnerable to this mental collapse. One of the first psychological signs of isolation is the disintegration of decision-making abilities. When explorers are left alone, without the support of colleagues or companions, they must rely entirely on their own judgment. At first, this might seem empowering, a moment of control and autonomy. But over time, the lack of feedback from others leads to an increasing sense of uncertainty. They begin to doubt their own decisions, questioning whether their choices are rational or driven by desperation. The absence of another perspective leaves them isolated not just physically but mentally. Their thinking becomes less objective and more subjective as they increasingly rely on their emotional state to guide their actions. This lack of rationality can result in poor decision-making, from uncalculated risks to irrational survival choices, that can endanger both their mission and their physical well-being. This cognitive disintegration also affects their sense of time. As we've already discussed, time becomes a blurry concept in isolation. The inability to mark time, whether through external cues like work or social interactions, leads to a warped perception of time, making it feel as though days blend into one another with no distinction. Time distortion can cause an individual to lose track of important tasks or deadlines, further compounding their isolation. What's worse is that this loss of time awareness affects their mental health. A lack of purpose can creep in, as the individual feels as though the days are simply passing by without any clear goal or achievement. The emptiness that accompanies this loss of time leads to feelings of futility, and this sense of hopelessness only deepens as isolation stretches on. In addition to cognitive impairments, hallucinations often begin to take root in the isolated mind. Prolonged solitude and sensory deprivation can trigger a breakdown of the individual's sense of what is real. Without the presence of others, the brain begins to create its own stimuli to fill the void. These hallucinations can take many forms: hearing voices, seeing figures in the distance, or feeling the presence of others when no one is around. The mind, in an attempt to cope with the overwhelming silence and emptiness, begins to distort reality. For explorers, this phenomenon is especially dangerous, as it undermines their ability to make rational decisions and increases their fear and paranoia. The onset of delusions often follows the hallucinations. As the explorer begins to lose touch with reality, they may start to believe that their isolation is not just a physical condition but a supernatural one. This could manifest as magical thinking, where the individual starts attributing unusual or random events to mystical forces. They may believe that the weather is acting in response to their presence, that animals are conspiring against them, or that they are being tested by a higher power. These delusions are often a defense mechanism, the mind attempting to give meaning to an experience that feels completely alien. In an isolated environment where every sound and movement is amplified, the individual's fear and anxiety increase, making the world seem like a much more dangerous and hostile place than it actually is. The fear of these imagined forces becomes just as powerful as any tangible threat, and the explorer is left vulnerable to the psychological consequences of these beliefs. Psychosis, a state where the individual's sense of reality becomes so distorted that they can no longer distinguish between what is real and what is imagined, is a natural progression for many explorers in extreme isolation. The psychological stress, combined with the lack of social interaction and sensory deprivation, creates the perfect breeding ground for psychosis. Hallucinations and delusions become more frequent, and the explorer is unable to trust their own perceptions. The breakdown of cognitive function and the onset of psychosis make it difficult for the individual to maintain any sense of purpose or clarity in their mission. They may begin to feel disconnected from their own thoughts, as if they are no longer in control of their mind. The fear of losing their grip on reality only intensifies their mental instability, creating a vicious cycle of psychological disintegration. It's also important to recognize the role of emotional vulnerability in the development of these psychological effects. The isolation that explorers face isn't just physical, it is emotional too. Many explorers, particularly those on solo expeditions, enter their missions with a sense of emotional baggage, guilt, grief, stress, or unresolved trauma. In isolation, there is no opportunity to share these burdens with others, to process difficult emotions, or to gain comfort from companionship. The absence of social support means that the emotional struggles that the explorer brings with them become amplified. Fear, anxiety, and grief build up over time, creating an emotional pressure cooker. This emotional strain makes the individual more susceptible to irrational thinking and psychological breakdown. The most disturbing aspect of isolation-induced madness is the emotional numbness that often follows. Initially, explorers may feel an intense emotional response to their situation: fear, sadness, anger. But as the days and weeks go by, these emotions may begin to feel blunted or even disconnected. The individual may become emotionally numb, unable to feel anything, neither joy nor sadness, neither fear nor comfort. This emotional shutdown is a defense mechanism, a way for the brain to protect itself from being overwhelmed by the constant psychological stress. However, this numbness also means that the explorer is unable to fully process the emotional impact of their situation, which can leave them psychologically adrift, unable to cope with the long-term effects of their experience. The final consequence of extended isolation is the complete collapse of personal identity. Over time, as explorers confront their inner turmoil and isolation-induced psychosis, they may begin to question not just the nature of their reality, but the nature of their own existence. Who are they now that they are alone in a vast, uncharted land? Without the ability to interact with others and gain feedback, they lose a crucial component of their sense of self. This identity crisis becomes even more pronounced as the explorer is forced to live in the shadow of their own fear, madness, and self-doubt. They no longer know who they are, and as the isolation wears on, they become consumed by the very psychological chaos they tried to escape. As we continue to explore the psychological devastation that results from extreme isolation, it's crucial to understand how prolonged solitude impacts the brain's stress response system and contributes to the psychological unraveling of explorers. Extreme isolation triggers a cascade of reactions within the body, deeply influencing the emotional, cognitive, and physical well-being of individuals who endure it. The toll this takes on the brain and body is not merely a result of physical exhaustion or boredom. It is driven by neurobiological changes that occur when someone is deprived of the basic human need for connection, stimuli, and structure. The stress response system, which is activated in moments of fear or crisis, becomes a constant presence in an isolated environment, leading to mental fatigue, cognitive dysfunction, and emotional instability. At the core of this process lies the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is the body's central stress response system. This system is responsible for regulating the production of cortisol, the hormone associated with stress. When an individual is faced with stressful or dangerous situations, the brain triggers the release of cortisol to prepare the body to respond. In short bursts, cortisol is an essential hormone for survival. It helps the body deal with immediate threats by increasing alertness and preparing the body for fight or flight. However, in prolonged isolation, the constant activation of the HPA axis leads to a chronic elevation of cortisol levels, which has a toxic impact on the brain and body. Elevated cortisol levels, when sustained over time, can lead to neurodegeneration, the loss of neural tissue in critical areas of the brain. The hippocampus, which is responsible for memory formation and emotional regulation, is particularly vulnerable to the effects of chronic stress. Under constant stress, the hippocampus can shrink, impairing memory, learning, and emotional processing. As a result, explorers may begin to experience memory loss, difficulty concentrating, and a diminished ability to regulate their emotions. The inability to think clearly, combined with emotional instability, sets the stage for psychosis and a profound breakdown of their mental state. Without the ability to process their surroundings or regulate their feelings, the individual becomes trapped in a psychological vortex, unable to navigate their thoughts or environment. Alongside the biological changes in the brain, sleep deprivation compounds the stress response. In an isolated setting, the disruptions to a person's sleep schedule, whether caused by environmental factors, anxiety, or the complete lack of external stimuli, have significant consequences for both the body and the mind. Sleep is vital for restoring brain function, consolidating memories, and regulating emotional responses. However, when explorers are deprived of adequate sleep, the effects can be disastrous. Sleep deprivation disrupts the production of key hormones like serotonin and dopamine, both of which play essential roles in mood regulation and cognitive function. The lack of sleep leads to depression, irritability, and exhaustion, which increases the likelihood of hallucinations, delusions, and other cognitive disturbances. As sleep deprivation continues, the body's immune system weakens, making the explorer more susceptible to illness and physical breakdown, further exacerbating the psychological strain. What's particularly dangerous is the feedback loop that develops between isolation and increased stress. As the explorer becomes more stressed, their cognitive impairments become more pronounced. Anxiety, which often accompanies isolation, exacerbates the feeling of helplessness. In turn, this anxiety triggers more stress responses, perpetuating the cycle. For explorers, trapped in extreme conditions without social interaction or support, this cycle can spiral out of control. As the stress response system becomes chronically activated, the individual loses their ability to control their emotions, thoughts, and behavior. The stress becomes self-perpetuating, and over time, the brain begins to experience psychological burnout. This burnout is often characterized by a profound sense of hopelessness and emotional exhaustion. The individual feels completely drained, not just physically but mentally and emotionally. They may begin to lose the capacity to regulate their thoughts and emotions, slipping into a state of depersonalization, a psychological condition in which they feel disconnected from themselves, as though they are observing their life from the outside. This feeling of detachment from the self further reinforces their sense of powerlessness, as they begin to question their ability to think clearly or make decisions. In this state, the individual may feel as though they are simply a witness to their own life, unable to act or make meaningful choices. The psychological strain brought on by isolation also leads to a phenomenon called learned helplessness. This term refers to a state where an individual, having been subjected to prolonged stress or trauma, begins to believe that they have no control over their circumstances. In extreme isolation, explorers may start to feel as though they are powerless to change their situation. No matter what they do, whether it's taking action to find food, seeking shelter, or trying to contact help, they are met with failure or the lack of any significant progress. This sense of helplessness can cause the explorer to become emotionally numb. They may stop trying to escape, stop thinking critically, and stop caring about their survival. The overwhelming sense of powerlessness becomes so all-encompassing that they may give up entirely, accepting their fate as inevitable. This state of learned helplessness is one of the most devastating effects of isolation, as it completely undermines the person's will to live. Hallucinations, which we discussed earlier, are a frequent companion to extreme isolation. In the absence of external stimuli, the brain begins to create its own experiences. Auditory and visual hallucinations are common. The explorer, desperately yearning for social interaction or stimulation, may start to hear voices, see figures, or perceive events that do not exist. These hallucinations are often not the result of a true mental illness but rather the brain's reaction to extreme sensory deprivation. The absence of feedback from the external world creates a void that the brain tries to fill with imagined experiences. For explorers who are already mentally and physically strained, these hallucinations can feel terrifying and real. They may begin to feel that they are no longer alone, hearing voices calling their name or seeing figures in the shadows. These experiences in turn increase feelings of paranoia and fear. The more isolated the individual becomes, the more likely these hallucinations are to spiral into delusions, where the explorer starts to believe that they are under some kind of threat or external control. As the explorer's mental state deteriorates, they may begin to experience an existential collapse. The lack of social feedback, the emotional numbness, and the cognitive dissonance all contribute to a profound loss of meaning. The explorer starts to question the purpose of their mission, their life, and their very existence. In the face of an unending, empty environment, they may begin to lose any sense of hope or direction. The existential weight of their isolation becomes too great to bear, and they may come to believe that their survival is meaningless, that their journey was futile, and that they are destined to be lost forever in an unfeeling universe. This existential crisis, combined with the breakdown of mental and physical health, leads to the psychological collapse of the explorer. The culmination of these psychological effects, the breakdown of cognitive function, the emotional exhaustion, and the overwhelming sense of meaninglessness, forms a psychological prison. The explorer, trapped in their mind and isolated from the world, finds themselves in a state of psychological entrapment that seems inescapable. This psychological collapse is often the point at which the individual faces their greatest test of will and survival. However, the question remains, is the human mind capable of recovering from such extreme isolation, or is it forever changed? As we move further into the devastating psychological effects of isolation, it becomes increasingly evident that the long-term consequences extend far beyond the immediate breakdown of cognitive functions and emotional health. The extreme conditions explorers face, coupled with the psychological strain of solitude, lead to lasting changes that affect both their sense of self and their connection to the world. One of the most profound long-term impacts of isolation is how it rewires the mind, often causing long-term psychological disorders that persist long after the explorer has returned to society. The first of these psychological repercussions is the phenomenon of post-isolation stress. This form of stress is not merely the product of physical exhaustion or the mental strain from isolation itself. It is the result of an ongoing struggle with the re-entry into normal life after the explorer has returned home. For many, the transition from the extreme solitude of their mission to the familiar, bustling environment of society can be jarring and overwhelming. The disconnection felt while isolated, where one's existence is reduced to survival, is replaced by the overwhelming flood of societal demands, expectations, and social interactions. Upon returning to society, explorers may experience social alienation. The world they return to no longer feels familiar. The relationships, environments, and structures they once knew may seem foreign, even unintelligible. This alienation stems from the disconnect between the self that was formed during isolation and the self that must now engage with a complex, socially driven world. For an explorer who has spent months or years in isolation, the rapid shift to a world full of noise, interactions, and expectations can trigger a state of psychological shock. They may experience difficulties re-establishing relationships, struggles with reintegration into family life, and challenges in navigating the complexities of modern society. This sense of disconnection from others is deeply rooted in the emotional and psychological transformations that occur during isolation. While isolated, the explorer's sense of self often becomes fragmented. They no longer receive the social feedback that validates their identity and behavior. Instead, they rely on their own internal dialogues, which often lead to cognitive distortions. Once they return to society, they find themselves questioning not only their role within the group but their identity as well. They are no longer sure who they are, nor do they know how to reconnect with the person they once were. This identity crisis often leads to feelings of emptiness, as they struggle to understand their place in the world. The absence of social feedback leads to a loss of personal coherence, where the reality of society is suddenly seen as foreign and out of reach. Emotional dysregulation is another major psychological effect of isolation. During the period of extreme solitude, explorers often suppress emotions to cope with the isolation. This suppression, however, causes emotional experiences to pile up, unresolved and unprocessed. Once the explorer returns to society, they often experience a flood of emotions that they are ill-equipped to handle. The emotions they once pushed down in order to survive, grief, anger, fear, sadness, emerge with overwhelming force, often leading to emotional instability. This emotional turbulence can result in mood swings, irritability, and aggressive outbursts as the explorer struggles to process feelings that have been buried for so long. The explorer may also experience profound depression, a condition that is often linked to the lack of purpose felt after returning from a long, isolated mission. In isolation, explorers are often driven by a clear goal, whether it's completing their mission, discovering new lands, or simply surviving. This goal provides them with structure and meaning in an otherwise empty and unpredictable environment. However, once the mission is over and they return home, that goal evaporates, leaving the explorer with a vacuum of meaning. This existential crisis can lead to depression as they grapple with the question of purpose. Without the mission to drive them, they may feel as if their life lacks direction or value. The loss of meaning is a devastating psychological consequence of isolation, as it strips away the very framework that gave the explorer a sense of self and purpose. One of the most significant emotional costs of isolation is the development of social anxiety. After spending so much time alone, the prospect of interacting with others can feel overwhelming and unnatural. Social norms that were once second nature, conversations, eye contact, body language, become alien and intimidating. The explorer may begin to feel uneasy in group settings, unsure of how to navigate social interactions. The discomfort of re-entering social environments is compounded by the fact that many explorers, upon their return, are often viewed as outsiders by society. The emotional distance they have created during their time alone is mirrored by the emotional distance others feel from them. This barrier creates an additional layer of social disconnection, making the explorer feel even more isolated and alone in the world they've returned to. One of the most insidious and long-lasting effects of extreme isolation is the development of trauma-related disorders, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The isolation, combined with the stress of the environment and the psychological breakdown that accompanies it, can lead to traumatic experiences that haunt the individual long after the isolation has ended. The emotional and physical toll of prolonged isolation, coupled with the fear of death, survival anxiety, and the overwhelming stress of being completely alone, can trigger PTSD. Individuals with PTSD experience intrusive memories, flashbacks, nightmares, and intense emotional reactions to triggers related to their time alone. The trauma of isolation is often hidden, as explorers may not immediately recognize the psychological damage they've sustained. The absence of support and the stigma of mental health issues often prevent them from seeking help, leading to a slow deterioration in their mental well-being. Furthermore, the social stigma surrounding mental health in explorers, especially in extreme situations, can prevent individuals from reaching out for help. The explorer may feel embarrassed or ashamed of their psychological struggles, worried that others will perceive them as weak or incapable. This societal pressure can worsen their condition, as they feel they must hide their trauma in order to fit back into society. The pressure to appear normal in a world that feels foreign only adds to the psychological burden, preventing the explorer from healing and finding peace. For some explorers, the damage caused by isolation can take years to recover from, if recovery is even possible. The mental health challenges they face, identity confusion, emotional dysregulation, depression, and social anxiety, become entrenched in their psyche, making it difficult for them to ever fully reintegrate into society. For some, the experience of isolation leaves them with lasting scars that never fully heal, shaping their worldview and limiting their ability to function in the world they once knew. As we continue to explore the long-term psychological effects of extreme isolation, it becomes clear that one of the most profound impacts of isolation is the psychological recovery process that follows. After explorers return from their solitary missions, they are not only dealing with the immediate aftermath of emotional and cognitive trauma, but they must also grapple with the long-term consequences that affect their relationships, their self-identity, and their reintegration into society. The effects of prolonged isolation are not easily reversible, and for many, the recovery process is fraught with psychological obstacles that can take years to overcome. One of the most immediate challenges that explorers face upon returning from isolation is readjusting to social life. After spending months or even years in solitude, the process of reconnecting with others can feel overwhelming. The social skills that they once took for granted, conversation, small talk, or simply engaging with others, become alien to them. Social norms that were once second nature feel suddenly awkward and unnatural. There is often a feeling of disconnection from the world they once knew, as if they are outsiders trying to fit back into a society that no longer feels familiar. This sense of alienation can be incredibly disorienting and emotionally painful. The psychological disconnection that explorers experience is not only from society, but also from themselves. When isolated for long periods of time, explorers lose the regular feedback they get from others that helps them maintain a clear sense of self. When they return, they often struggle to reconcile their past identity with the person they have become during their time in isolation. They may feel as though they are no longer the person they once were, and this can lead to a crisis of identity. They must confront the reality that they have changed fundamentally, and this identity shift can create feelings of loss and confusion. The person they were before their isolation may no longer feel like a reflection of who they are now, and this emotional detachment from their past self can lead to a profound sense of dislocation. One of the most significant challenges faced by explorers during reintegration is the pressure to appear normal. Society often expects individuals to return from extreme situations and pick up right where they left off, without any indication of psychological struggle. However, for many explorers, this expectation is unrealistic. The trauma they have experienced, whether it's emotional distress, identity confusion, or post-traumatic stress, does not simply disappear after their return. The internal struggle to reconcile their past experiences with their current reality can feel overwhelming. However, the pressure to appear normal can make it even harder to reach out for help or acknowledge the emotional scars they carry. This social pressure to hide their trauma only worsens the psychological burden, making it difficult for explorers to seek the support they desperately need. The psychological trauma from isolation can also create relationship difficulties. When explorers return from extreme solitude, their relationships with loved ones and friends are often strained. Family members, partners, and friends may struggle to understand the psychological challenges the explorer is facing. For loved ones, it can be difficult to comprehend the emotional distance that has formed during the period of isolation. The explorer may seem distant, withdrawn, or even emotionally numb. This disconnection can cause frustration and misunderstanding within relationships. Loved ones may feel rejected or abandoned by the explorer, as they are unable to bridge the emotional gap created by isolation. Conversely, the explorer may feel disconnected from their loved ones, as they can no longer relate to the lives they left behind. One of the most common psychological effects explorers face when reintegrating into society is hypervigilance. While in isolation, the explorer becomes hyper-aware of their environment, constantly alert to potential threats or dangers. This heightened state of awareness becomes ingrained over time and does not easily fade once they return to a less threatening environment. In many cases, explorers experience paranoia or an exaggerated sense of danger, even when surrounded by safety. The inability to let go of this hypervigilance can lead to anxiety and sleep disturbances, as the mind remains on high alert long after the need for such constant vigilance has passed. It is not uncommon for explorers to feel on edge, easily startled, or paranoid, as though they are constantly under threat, even in familiar, safe environments. This mental tension can affect their ability to relax or fully engage with the world around them. Alongside hypervigilance, flashbacks and intrusive memories from the time of isolation are common. The mind, unable to process the traumatic nature of prolonged solitude, begins to relive the experience in disturbing ways. Flashbacks can occur unexpectedly, triggered by sounds, smells, or situations that remind the explorer of their time in isolation. These flashbacks can be intensely vivid, making the individual feel as though they are back in the isolated environment once again. The fear, anxiety, and emotional pain associated with these memories can feel just as real as when they were originally experienced, preventing the explorer from fully being present in their current life. These intrusive memories contribute to the feeling of psychological disconnection from their new reality and can trigger bouts of depression, anxiety, or even despair. As we've seen, explorers who have undergone extreme isolation often return from their missions with a sense of dissociation, a feeling of being disconnected from their surroundings, their relationships, and themselves. This emotional and cognitive dissociation can make it incredibly difficult to reintegrate into society. The person they were before their time in isolation may no longer seem like a reflection of who they are now. They may feel as though they are living in a disjointed reality, where the past and present are disconnected, and the life they left behind feels like a foreign world. This sense of emotional dislocation can cause the explorer to feel out of sync with everything they once knew, leading to feelings of disorientation and loneliness. While the psychological impact of isolation is undoubtedly profound, it's important to note that healing is possible. The process of recovering from isolation-induced trauma is complex and requires a combination of psychotherapy, support networks, and personal resilience. Therapy, especially cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT) and EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, can help explorers process their trauma and begin to reconnect with their past selves. Building support systems, whether through family, friends, or professional groups, can help rebuild the emotional connections that were severed during isolation. Over time, explorers can regain a sense of identity, purpose, and belonging. However, the process of reintegration is a long-term journey. For many, the effects of isolation never fully fade, but with the right support, explorers can adapt to their new lives and find peace. The emotional wounds of isolation may leave permanent scars, but they do not have to define the explorer's future. With time, understanding, and a commitment to healing, the mind can begin to recover from the damage of isolation and once again find meaning in the world they have returned to. As explorers continue to reintegrate into society after their period of isolation, the psychological scars they carry often result in a long, slow recovery process. The traumatic effects of prolonged solitude are not easily erased, and the journey to psychological healing can be filled with moments of setbacks, relapses, and intense internal struggle. In this part, we will focus on the recovery process, exploring the ways in which individuals who have experienced extreme isolation can gradually rebuild their emotional and psychological well-being. We will also discuss the importance of self-compassion, support systems, and acceptance in overcoming the traumatic aftermath of isolation. One of the first steps in the healing process for explorers is to come to terms with their psychological trauma. The act of acknowledging that they have been deeply affected by their experience is crucial in moving forward. For many, there is a tendency to suppress the emotional pain caused by isolation, believing that it is a sign of weakness or failure to admit the depth of their distress. However, this suppression only prolongs the recovery process. The first step toward healing is for the individual to accept that the trauma they have experienced is real and that it has had a lasting effect on their mental health. Psychotherapy is often an essential component of recovery. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, in particular, has been shown to be effective in helping individuals process the emotional damage caused by isolation. CBT allows individuals to identify and challenge distorted thinking patterns, such as negative self-talk, feelings of inadequacy, and irrational fears. By working through these thought patterns, explorers can begin to reframe their experience, replacing feelings of guilt and shame with a healthier perspective on their actions. Therapy can also help explorers develop coping mechanisms to manage anxiety, stress, and depression, as well as strategies for rebuilding their emotional resilience. However, healing does not happen solely within the confines of therapy. For many explorers, the process of recovering from isolation requires them to reconnect with the world, to re-establish relationships, rebuild trust, and re-enter society in a way that feels authentic to them. This is often the most difficult part of the recovery process. After prolonged isolation, individuals may find that they have drifted away from their loved ones and the social networks that once provided them with support. This emotional distance can create feelings of loneliness, as the individual may feel disconnected from the people who once defined their sense of self. Rebuilding these connections requires time, patience, and a willingness to be vulnerable. The process of reconnecting with others may be marked by a sense of awkwardness and self-consciousness. After being isolated for so long, individuals may find it challenging to re-enter the world of social interactions. They may feel that they are outsiders, unable to engage with people in the same way they once did. This disconnection can create feelings of insecurity and self-doubt, as the individual may worry that others will perceive them as strange, detached, or unrelatable. Overcoming this fear of judgment requires self-compassion and the ability to accept that recovery is a gradual process. It's important for explorers to be kind to themselves, to acknowledge their struggles without shame, and to give themselves permission to experience the healing journey at their own pace. Support systems are also a crucial element in the recovery process. After spending so much time in isolation, explorers often feel as though they are emotionally adrift, with no one to lean on for support. Rebuilding these support networks is vital for recovery. Whether it's through family, close friends, or professional support groups, being surrounded by a network of empathetic individuals can help explorers feel grounded and understood. Support systems provide emotional validation and encouragement, and they remind the individual that they are not alone in their journey. In addition to reconnecting with others, the process of rediscovering purpose is also essential for recovery. After enduring extreme isolation, explorers may struggle with a sense of meaninglessness, a feeling that their life lacks direction or value. This loss of purpose is one of the most profound psychological consequences of isolation. The feeling of being cut off from the world for so long can make it difficult for explorers to reintegrate into the social and professional roles they once held. Without a clear sense of purpose, life can feel aimless, leaving the individual in a state of existential despair. To rebuild their sense of purpose, explorers must first reconnect with their passions and goals, the things that once brought them joy, fulfillment, and drive. For some, this may involve returning to the exploration that they loved, perhaps in a different capacity or a different location. For others, it may mean finding new avenues for personal growth, such as engaging in creative pursuits, learning new skills, or contributing to their communities. Finding purpose outside of the mission that led them into isolation is an important part of rediscovering meaning in life. Mindfulness practices and meditation can also be effective in helping explorers ground themselves in the present moment. Mindfulness encourages individuals to focus on the here and now, rather than dwelling on the past or future. This practice helps to reduce the rumination and negative thought patterns that often accompany trauma and isolation. Mindfulness also encourages self-awareness, allowing the explorer to tune into their emotional state and begin the process of emotional regulation. Through mindfulness, explorers can begin to reframe their experience, seeing it not as something that has broken them but as a powerful journey of self-discovery and resilience. Another powerful tool in the recovery process is physical activity. Exercise has been shown to have significant mental health benefits, including reducing symptoms of depression and anxiety, improving mood, and promoting emotional well-being. For explorers, engaging in regular physical activity can serve as a way to reconnect with their body and gain a sense of control over their physical and emotional state. Whether through hiking, swimming, running, or yoga, physical activity provides a healthy outlet for the stress and emotional tension accumulated during isolation. It also provides a sense of achievement and empowerment, something the explorer may have lost during their time alone. Lastly, acceptance is key to the healing process. It is crucial for explorers to accept the reality that their experience of isolation has changed them, and that they may never return to the person they were before their journey. This acceptance does not mean resignation. It means embracing the transformation that has occurred and learning to find peace with the new version of oneself. Healing is not about going back to who they once were, but rather about growing through the experience and finding a new sense of purpose, connection, and meaning. As explorers continue their emotional and psychological journey toward healing, it becomes clear that the process of recovery from the extreme isolation they experienced is not linear. There are moments of progress and relapse, and the journey to reintegration can be incredibly difficult. One of the most significant aspects of recovery is the exploration of post-traumatic growth, a concept that refers to the potential for individuals to experience positive change as a result of overcoming trauma. For explorers who have undergone extreme isolation, this kind of growth is possible, but it requires deep self-reflection, resilience, and the ability to find meaning in their experiences. Post-traumatic growth is often viewed as the process by which individuals rebuild their lives after experiencing severe hardship, coming out of the experience not only surviving but also thriving in ways they never imagined. While trauma, such as prolonged isolation or the emotional devastation that comes from being cut off from society, undoubtedly leaves scars, it can also provide an opportunity for self-discovery, strengthening inner resilience and personal transformation. For many explorers, the process of reintegrating into society and confronting the emotional and psychological consequences of their journey leads to profound shifts in how they view themselves and their relationship with the world. One of the first signs of post-traumatic growth is the redefinition of purpose. Many explorers enter isolation with a clear mission, whether it's scientific exploration, pushing the boundaries of human endurance, or the pursuit of discovery. The journey is often driven by external goals and external validation. However, when they return from isolation, many explorers find that their previous purpose no longer resonates with them. The world they return to is filled with external noise, distractions, and societal expectations. The simplicity and rawness of isolation have allowed them to reconnect with their inner selves and see the world with a fresh perspective. As explorers begin to confront their own emotional wounds, many experience a shift in values, prioritizing personal growth, inner peace, and meaningful relationships over external accolades or achievements. They may find that their identity is no longer defined by external accomplishments but by their ability to survive, adapt, and find meaning in their own experiences. This shift often leads to a newfound appreciation for life, not as a series of tasks to be completed but as a journey of exploration in which the most important discoveries are often internal. The depth of the self-reflection that isolation prompts can lead explorers to make significant changes in their lives, such as pursuing careers that align more closely with their personal values or engaging in more authentic relationships that provide emotional fulfillment. Resilience also plays a major role in post-traumatic growth. For many explorers, the experience of isolation tests their mental and emotional strength in ways they could never have predicted. The psychological toll of being completely alone for an extended period is profound, and the individual may feel completely broken by the end of it. But as they begin to heal and process their trauma, they often realize that they have developed an inner strength that was previously untapped. The act of surviving the extreme psychological and physical stress of isolation has, in many ways, fortified their mental health and resilience. The process of overcoming this trauma gives them the tools to face future challenges with greater courage and determination. Explorers who experience post-traumatic growth often develop a heightened sense of empathy and compassion for others. Having endured extreme solitude and emotional hardship, they gain a deep understanding of the human condition and the psychological struggle that many people face. This empathy allows them to connect with others on a deeper level, offering support to those who may be struggling with their own emotional challenges. The experience of isolation often ignites a desire to help others navigate their own battles with mental health, creating a sense of community and shared purpose. Despite the potential for growth, the reality is that healing from the trauma of extreme isolation is not without challenges. One of the most difficult obstacles to overcome is re-establishing trust, both in oneself and in others. The prolonged period of isolation creates a sense of psychological distrust, where the individual may feel that they are no longer capable of making sound decisions or being emotionally vulnerable. The fear of being hurt again, whether by others or by their own mind, can make it difficult to re-enter the world and form meaningful connections. Trust is foundational to healthy relationships, and rebuilding it requires time, patience, and a deep commitment to vulnerability. Social reintegration is also an ongoing process. When explorers return from isolation, they may find it difficult to reconnect with the relationships they left behind. The emotional distance caused by their time alone can create a barrier that feels almost impossible to overcome. Loved ones and friends may struggle to understand the psychological changes the explorer has undergone, and the explorer may feel alienated from those they once knew. Rebuilding these connections requires the explorer to be open and honest about their experiences while also being patient with themselves and others. The emotional scars from isolation can make it difficult to navigate social situations, but with time and effort, many explorers find that they can rebuild the relationships that matter most to them. The process of healing from isolation also requires a spiritual or existential reckoning. During isolation, many explorers are forced to confront life's most fundamental questions. Why am I here? What is the meaning of my life? What does it mean to survive? These questions don't have easy answers, and the answers that explorers arrive at are often deeply personal. Some may turn to spirituality or philosophy to seek meaning and comfort, while others may look inward to understand their purpose. This existential reckoning is often a catalyst for personal growth, as explorers come to terms with the fact that life is not always predictable or easily understood. Learning to live with uncertainty and embracing impermanence can be an incredibly freeing process, allowing the individual to redefine their relationship with the world. Another aspect of post-isolation recovery is the need for emotional regulation. The emotional turbulence that comes from isolation and its aftermath can lead to emotional instability. As the explorer reintegrates into their life, they may experience mood swings, irritability, and emotional outbursts. Learning to regulate emotions, to feel without being overwhelmed by emotion, is an essential part of the healing process. Explorers who have faced isolation often turn to mindfulness, meditation, or therapy to help them manage their emotional states. The ability to regulate emotions helps the explorer regain control over their reactions and feel empowered rather than overwhelmed by the intensity of their emotions. As we arrive at the final part of our exploration into the psychological effects of isolation and how explorers cope with the aftermath, it becomes clear that recovery is not a fixed destination. It is an ongoing journey. After enduring the profound emotional and mental toll of extreme isolation, explorers must navigate the complexities of reintegration, healing, and growth. The effects of isolation are deep, and for many, the scars it leaves behind will never fully disappear. However, what is equally clear is that there is hope for recovery. The human mind is capable of remarkable resilience, and with the right tools, support, and mindset, explorers can move forward, emerging from their psychological struggles stronger and more self-aware. One of the key aspects of long-term recovery is the acceptance of what cannot be undone. The psychological effects of isolation are often profound and irreversible. Explorers who have experienced extreme isolation may never fully regain the sense of normality they once had. The trauma they've endured, the disconnection they've felt, and the identity shifts they've undergone are part of their story now. However, recovery involves accepting these changes and embracing them as part of their journey. The more an individual struggles to deny the impact of their isolation, the more they resist healing. Acceptance isn't about resigning to a life of suffering, it's about recognizing the reality of their experience without judgment and finding a way to live with it, rather than fighting against it. Self-compassion is another critical tool for recovery. For many explorers, there is a tendency to view their struggles through a lens of self-criticism, a belief that they should have been stronger, better, or more capable. They may believe that their emotional distress or their inability to cope with their experiences is a sign of weakness. This self-judgment is often the greatest barrier to healing. It's important for explorers to understand that healing is not linear, and it is okay to feel vulnerable, confused, or lost after returning from isolation. The experience of extreme isolation is not a reflection of personal failure, but rather an inevitable result of a deeply human need for connection and support. By practicing self-compassion, by treating themselves with the same kindness and understanding that they would offer a loved one, They create the emotional space necessary for recovery. While self-compassion is essential, forgiveness, both of oneself and others, is just as crucial in the healing process. The trauma of isolation often leads to feelings of guilt, shame, and regret. Some explorers may feel that they have failed in some way, that their mission or journey should have been completed differently, or that they have disappointed those who were relying on them. Others may feel guilty for leaving their loved ones behind, even if they never intended to cause harm. But these feelings of guilt only perpetuate emotional stagnation. In order to heal, explorers must find a way to forgive themselves for their perceived shortcomings and mistakes. This doesn't mean excusing harmful actions, but rather acknowledging their humanity and releasing the burden of self-blame. Forgiveness allows them to let go of the negative emotions that weigh them down and prevents them from being trapped in a cycle of regret. In addition to self-forgiveness, many explorers must also navigate the complex issue of forgiving others, especially the people they may feel abandoned or betrayed them. Loved ones, friends, or colleagues who were left behind often feel anger, resentment, or confusion when an explorer disappears or isolates themselves for long periods. For the explorer, returning to those relationships and repairing the emotional damage is one of the hardest parts of the recovery process. It's important to understand that reconciliation is not about erasing the past but rather acknowledging the hurt and working through it together. Forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean that everything will return to normal or that past mistakes will be forgotten, but it provides a path toward emotional healing and restoring trust. For explorers, it's also essential to rebuild a sense of connection and community. After isolation, there can be a tendency to withdraw, to avoid relationships or social situations out of fear of judgment or rejection. However, true healing happens in connection with others, whether through family, friends, or a community of like-minded individuals who understand the trauma of isolation. The explorer may initially struggle with social reintegration, feeling out of sync with others, or unsure of how to engage in normal social activities. But finding a supportive network is critical for emotional well-being. These connections remind the individual that they are not alone, that their experiences are valid, and that there are people who will support them through their healing journey. The healing journey also involves learning how to live with the legacy of isolation. While it's crucial to work through trauma and process the emotional pain, it's also important to recognize that this experience has shaped who they are today. The scars of isolation may never fully fade, but they can be woven into the fabric of their life as a testament to their strength, resilience, and growth. Rather than being a source of shame or regret, the experience of isolation can become a source of empowerment, as explorers learn to live with the knowledge that they survived something unimaginable. They come to understand that their strength lies not in erasing the past but in embracing it and finding ways to integrate it into their future. As explorers continue on their healing path, it's important for them to celebrate small victories along the way. The road to recovery is long and there will be setbacks. But each step forward, whether it's reconnecting with a loved one, returning to work, or simply having a good day, deserves to be acknowledged and celebrated. Recovery is a journey, not a destination, and it's important for explorers to recognize their progress. By doing so, they build emotional momentum that helps them move forward. Finally, as explorers move toward emotional wholeness, they come to realize that life after isolation is a process of constant adaptation. It's about accepting that they are not the same person they were before, but rather a new version of themselves, one that has been shaped, hardened, and refined by the experiences they endured. They will always carry the lessons of isolation with them, but instead of viewing these lessons as scars, they can embrace them as parts of their personal growth. In the end, isolation may have broken them down, but it also gave them the opportunity to rebuild, stronger, more resilient, and more self-aware than ever before. Their journey is one of profound transformation, and though the road to recovery may be long, the future remains full of possibilities. They are no longer defined by their past isolation. They are defined by how they rose from it, how they healed, and how they continue to thrive. If you enjoyed this exploration into the psychology of isolation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Stay tuned for more insightful content that dives deep into the human mind and beyond.